Hi everyone. Something was a little bit off with my microphone. The sound quality is not very great, and sorry about that. But yeah, didn't have time to try to re-record everything, so we'll just make the best of it, and I'll try to get fixed for the next one. Thanks.
Hi everyone! This week we're going to talk about Chapter 2 of our textbook. So I hope that you're following along with the textbook pretty well. We also have our first exam this week. It'll cover Chapters 1 and Chapters 2, so the last two videos that we've addressed. We've been talking in very broad generalities so far about inquiry, about logic, about critical thinking. That's going to continue to be true in this chapter as well. We're not going to get super specific until next week once we get all this necessary background information set up. Right, so I think that's all I have for an introduction today, so let's just dive right in. Alright, so today's topic is going to be Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is called The Guidelines for Inquiry. And what we're going to get by the end of today's lecture is a series of steps that you can follow in order to at least begin an inquiry successfully. The last step will be sort of the rest of the course in effect. But the first four, anyway, are things that you can sort of do to begin an inquiry, get it off on the right foot. So the first of these, you should begin an inquiry by identifying the issue or issues that are involved in the thing that you're investigating. So maybe let's start here. If you've ever heard an argument between people, or heard an argument in the news, or in Twitter, or whatever, and if you thought it doesn't even seem like the people who are arguing are even talking about the same thing, right? They almost seem as if one side's talking about one issue, the other side's talking about kind of at least a different issue, and it's not exactly clear how they're related or how either side is addressing the concerns of the others. Well, if you've had this thought, you're certainly not alone. Even when people make a good faith effort to inquire well, and as we've talked about, that doesn't always even happen, but even when it does, it's very easy to lose track of exactly what it is that you're investigating in the course of an inquiry, and in particular what the central issue is, and how that central issue relates to a whole host of sort of tertiary issues. So when you begin an inquiry, the very first thing that you should do, and if you're doing this with another person, you could do it explicitly, right? Stop, pause, go through it together. You should begin by identifying what's the central issue that we're talking about, and what are the other sort of issues that we're going to need to address, perhaps in the course of addressing that one central issue. Let's look at an example. So let's say a local school district is thinking of making fruits and vegetables mandatory in all school lunches. And we wanted to investigate whether or not this was a good idea, whether or not this was the right thing to do. Alright, so just as I phrased it, there's a whole host of issues, a whole host of topics we could investigate as part of an inquiry. First, we could investigate, are fruits and vegetables really healthy? Presumably that's why the school district would mandate them. If they're not actually healthy, no point in the mandate. Another issue we could perhaps investigate: will children eat these fruits and vegetables even if they are mandatorily included in all school lunches? After all, there's no point in making this mandatory policy if it's not going to actually work, or if it's not going to sort of accomplish its intended purpose. And then lastly, one topic we could investigate is, should schools actually mandate healthy eating? Is that the kind of thing that public schools, say as an institute of the federal government, should be involved in mandating for people? Alright, so we've got these three issues. Which one actually seems to be the central one, the main one that we're going to discuss if our goal is to inquire into the school board's new policy? Well, I would say that issues 1 and 2 are, in this case, kind of secondary or tertiary questions, and that issue number 3 is the main concern. Right? If it's not the case that the school board is sort of authorized or allowed, or that it's wrong in some sense for the school board to mandate healthy eating, if that's not the sort of thing that the school board should be doing, then it really doesn't matter if fruits and vegetables are healthy, and it doesn't really matter if children will eat them if it's not the sort of thing the school board should be doing in the first place. Right? Those issues matter. They might well come up in the course of our inquiry, but number 3 in this case is our main target, our main goal. It's the main thing that we should be discussing and trying to figure out, and everything else should be in service of establishing 3. So if we've established that it is the case that public schools should mandate healthy eating for students, then we would wonder, is this the best way of actually accomplishing that proposal, right? Are the particular fruits and vegetables the right ones, or are the children likely to eat on the basis of it? So if we identified the actual central issue, we can make sure that everything we discuss in the course of our inquiry is ultimately going to relate back to the central topic. Alright, so now we've identified the central issue at play within our inquiry. The next step is to identify what kinds of claims or judgments are at stake in these issues that we've identified. Different kinds of topics simply require different kinds of investigations, and they also call for different kinds of evidence. We're not going to talk about everything the same way, and we're not going to count everything as evidence equally, depending on what it is we're talking about or what it is we're investigating. So once you've identified all of the issues, and once you understand what's central in amongst those issues, the next step is to figure out what kind of investigation these issues call for. Broadly speaking, there are 5 kinds of judgments that we could sort of make to resolve a question. Let's look at some examples of all 5. The first kind of judgment is what's called factual judgments. These are really descriptive cases, right? We'd resolve the issue, we'd resolve the question that we have, if only we could more accurately describe how the world works. So in that example that we were looking at concerning the mandatory fruits and vegetables in the case of the school board, the first issue, are fruits and vegetables them actually healthy? That's a factual question. We can resolve it just by knowing more about the world, knowing more about fruits and vegetables. Next, we have 3 different kinds of what are called evaluative judgments. Factual judgments are purely descriptive. If we know what the world's like well enough, we'll resolve the issue. All 3 of these kinds of evaluative judgments, we're going to go beyond merely describing the world in various sorts of ways. In various sorts of ways, we want to know what's good or bad. So let's go through all 3 of them. Our second kind of judgment is what are called instrumental judgments. Here, the issue would be resolved if we could determine whether or not some course of action is likely to bring about a desired outcome, right? Whether or not some behavior is going to be effective. Again, in the case of the example we've been running through, the question of whether or not children will actually eat healthier if fruits and vegetables are a mandatory part of school lunches, that question could be resolved with an instrumental judgment. We want to know, is this policy going to work? Is it going to accomplish the goal? If you're ever looking at something like that, that's an instrumental judgment. We've also got ethical judgments. This is another kind of evaluative judgment. Ethical judgments are where the issue would be resolved if we could determine whether or not some course of action is right or wrong. And again, in this case of public school lunches, right, the ultimate central issue, I think, is ultimately an ethical one in this case. Is it right for public schools to mandate healthy eating? Is that within their purview? Is that the sort of thing they should be doing? We're not talking about if it'll work, so it's not an instrumental judgment, and we're not just asking for a description about the world. We're asking for an ethical judgment. Is it correct? Is it right in some sort of moral sense that the action be taken? And then the last of our kinds of evaluative judgments is what are called aesthetic judgments. We don't really have any of these with the case of the school lunches, so let's think back to a topic we talked about last week, a disagreement about whether or not the new Taylor Swift album is a good album. That would be an example of an aesthetic question, and it would be resolved with an aesthetic judgment. We're not asking, is Taylor Swift's album going to perhaps make a lot of money? Maybe that would be an instrumental judgment. And we're not asking, is it ethical either? We're not saying, is it a morally outstanding album or a morally evil album, right? That doesn't really make any sense. If we ask, is it a good or bad album, we're asking a question about beauty, in a sense. Is it a beautiful album? Is it ugly in some very broad sense of beauty and ugly? Those are aesthetic questions, and so questions of that sort can be answered with aesthetic judgments. In addition to factual judgments and our 3 different kinds of evaluative judgments, there's one last kind of judgment. These are called interpretive judgments. In interpretive cases, we're again going beyond the facts, so it's not a factual judgment. We don't just want to describe the situation well enough. But we're also not really going to be looking at good or bad exactly. When we're engaged in an interpretive inquiry, what we're concerned with is what something means. So here'd be an example of that. Let's say that instead of asking whether or not the Taylor Swift album was good or bad, instead we're going to ask, what does the Taylor Swift album mean? What's it about? What's she trying to say in the album? Those are examples of interpretive questions. Right? It's not just tell me what the world's like. It's not just tell me if something's good or bad. It's what's the significance of something? What ramifications does it have? What does it tell us about the world or humanity or ourselves or whatever? Every time there's an election of any sort, so you'll hear a lot of talks about this, where every time there's an election, what does this election mean? What does the vote mean? What can we derive from it? What does it tell us about Americans? Okay, if anything kind of question like that, those are all interpretive questions. They get answered by interpretive judgments. Alright, so these are our 5 kinds of judgments. We'll look at some of these in a little bit more detail as we sort of go throughout the semester, but at least just to start with, I wanted to lay them all out for you. The reason why your sort of next step after identifying the central issue involved in the inquiry should be to identify what kind of judgment is going to resolve it, is that it's going to play a kind of bearing about what kinds of evidence are going to be relevant toward evaluating and reaching a real conclusion. So let's say you're debating an ethical question. Let's say you're trying to figure out if the school board should mandate healthy eating for all students. Well, okay, that's an ethical question, we've said. In resolving an ethical question, statements of fact might well matter, right? We might well want to know whether or not fruits and vegetables are really healthy or something. That might be, maybe that's relevant somewhere along the line. But it's never going to answer the question. You're not going to resolve the issue just by describing a bunch of facts. Nor can you describe the issue just by describing what's useful or what's beautiful or giving interpretations of things. For an ethical question, it can only ultimately be resolved by an ethical kind of judgment. And the kinds of evidence that are involved in ethical judgments are different than the kinds of evidence that'll be acceptable in other arenas. Similarly, if I'm asking a scientific question, usually those are factual, right? I want to know, how fast that asteroid is moving around the sun. Right? That's a description of the world. There, I don't need to bring in really things. The central thing that will answer the question is going to just be describing what the world is like, and so a factual kind of answer will resolve the inquiry. You see this a lot where people get this confused though, right? How often do we hear scientists, for example, interviewed about their opinion about, say, abortion? Right? Again, scientists maybe can tell us some useful facts about abortion, useful facts about a fetus, yada, yada, yada. But those useful facts in and of themselves, while they might help us reach an ethical judgment, they themselves will never be sufficient for an ethical judgment. So that's why our second step, figure out what kind of judgments will actually resolve the inquiry. Then we can make sure we're looking for the right kind of evidence. So once you've figured out what the central issues are and what kind of judgments could be used to resolve those issues, your next step in starting an inquiry is basically the research step. This is where you figure out what are the relevant reasons and arguments on the various sides of the issue. This is pretty much just do a survey in effect, right? Figure out what kinds of things people are saying about the various issues, take stock of the pool of arguments, the pool of evidence available to you. So we saw that there are three issues at play. One central, in this case of whether or not the school board should be allowed to mandate fruits and vegetables in all school lunches. Amongst the first issue that we saw, right, are fruits and vegetables actually healthy? Once we sort of take stock of what things people are saying, we find almost unanimous consensus, at least amongst sort of relevant people, relevant sort of experts, that yes, fruits and vegetables do indeed seem to be part of a healthy diet. So that, actually might solve the issue. We can't really even find another side. That maybe is all there is to say about that issue. But the third question, the one that I've sort of been arguing is the central question, the sort of ethical issue, here we actually do see arguments sort of on both sides of the issue. Some people say that it's the government's job, in effect, to ensure that it's as easy as possible for people to be healthy. And school lunches, being a very easy place, make that as healthy as possible. Right? That should be something that the government should obviously do. On the other hand, you get people, though, who argue that this is sort of an overreach of government authority, and that people should be free to choose to eat healthily or to choose not to eat healthily. So what we have then is two competing arguments, right? We'd want to gather up those competing arguments in this third step, and then see what happens once we combine them all together. So I've done some research, I've gotten a sense of what the different sides are in this issue, what sort of things people have said, arguments people have made in this issue that we're investigating. What's next? Next, we actually gather some relevant context. There might be factors at play in evaluating the issue that go beyond maybe what I would have originally expected. Things that maybe are relevant, so in the case of the school district, is obesity and poor nutrition a very large problem at the school? Maybe I would have a different sense of what's ethically allowable depending on how I answer that sort of contextual question. Are there other eating options on campus besides school lunches? Right? Again, that would seemingly lessen the concern that this is removing parental freedom or student freedom. But I guess there's other options. Is this a wealthier district or a poorer district? Maybe in a poorer district, we're more concerned about access issues and inclusiveness issues, and so we'd be more likely to want to ensure that school lunches are healthier. What's the school's track record with things like caring about parental and student autonomy? If the school has a good track record of caring about those things in other arenas, maybe we'll be more likely to give them the benefit of the doubt in this case. As a general rule, you wanted to know the rough history of whatever issue it is you're investigating. That's sort of the fourth step. Alright, so these first 4 steps that we've gone through for beginning an inquiry, they're all basically introductory steps, right? They're basically setting everything up so that you can begin the inquiry in a sort of a productive way. You've got a good foundation for it. Alright, so what's the last step? Step 5. Well, here's where you comparatively evaluate all the reasons and arguments and ultimately reach at and arrive at a reasoned judgment. Okay. Or, in other words, where you do all the work. This is where the inquiry sort of route happens. This is where all the logic and critical thinking stuff we're going to talk about. The rest of the semester comes in this sort of this last step in effect. This is where the magic happens. We'll spend really the rest of the semester talking about this last step. How can we go about evaluating arguments? How can we go about comparing their relative strengths and weaknesses? We haven't yet defined what an argument is. This is actually going to be a key part of logic and critical thinking. This is what we're going to do in Chapter 3. So I think this is a good place to sort of end our discussion of Chapter 2 for right now. We'll then begin in Chapter 3, pick up right from here with this idea of how do we evaluate an argument, what even is an argument. Alright, I think that'll do it for this week's lecture. Remember, we have our first very short exam, I'm guessing most of you should find this pretty easy. This is more just an introduction to the format almost more than anything else. We'll have our very first exam after class this week. So make sure you're sort of prepared, you're caught up with all the homework. If anyone has any questions about the exam format, remember they're going to be online using Canvas. We can also talk about that a little bit more in class itself. The questions will look exactly like the questions you've seen on the quizzes, the questions you've seen on the in-class activities, and also the questions you've seen on the homework assignments. Alright, I think that'll do it for today. Hope you all are doing well. Bye!